are created equal. These inspiring ideals of freedom and equality are conveyed in the Declaration of Independence. The statement inspired generations of Americans to strive for their inalienable rights, which is the right to be free. The nation was fighting for freedom, just not for everyone. In the 16th session of the series, Time for the Nations to Reap, we will talk about why slavery in America was worse than all other countries.
The title is meant to be provocative. 250 years of slavery, 100 years of legal discrimination and segregation and terrorist violence against black lives and bodies. 50 years of a civil rights movement, 7 years of a black president. We are still not cleansed from all of this, and there's a need, I think, for those of us especially that are people of faith to go deeper and talk about this language of sin. Now, a lot of white folks like to think that the sin was the slavery. The truth is there were slaveries before our slavery. There were Greeks who were slaves of Romans, but those Greek slaves tutored elite Roman children. They were never had their families destroyed. I'm a Christian, but it was the Christians in the UK and the US that said, in effect, that you can't do, and this was lift every voice and sing, got to this right away, you can't do what we were going to do to indigenous people and kidnapped Africans. You can't do that to those you believe are made in the image of God. Genesis 1 says, then God said, let us make them in our image, imago Dei. But when you're going to turn people into chattel property and make them into the most important economic resource of a new nation, free labor, you've got to throw away imago Dei. And so we did. So the opening proclamation of this nation was not all men are created equal, whatever that meant to them. It was that indigenous lives and black lives don't matter. The founding principle of this nation. That was it.
We have been talking about the slave trading past of European nations, and it is now time to talk about slavery in the United States. Did you know that it was actually Britain that brought slavery to America? That's a fact that's often forgotten in this saga. Let's look at this article from BBC News. It's entitled, "The British Role in America's Tainted Past." It says Britain put its stamp on America from the beginning. It was Britain who brought the first unfree Africans to this country and helped to start slavery in America, says Professor Cassandra Newby Alexander, a historian at Norfolk State University in Virginia. At Old Point Comfort, where people now fish on the nearby jetty, she points out the spot where it is believed the first ship carrying slaves came into what was then the colony of Virginia. It was late August of 1619, and it was the English vessel White Lion. Professor Newby Alexander says of the ship that it is believed brought 20 men and women that had been ripped from their homeland in what is now Angola. Once they were here, they began to sell those individuals that they saw as part of their cargo to the leadership in the colony. Another unreported fact is that Thomas Jefferson wanted to include an anti-slavery passage in the Declaration of Independence, but it was removed. Let's look at this information from History.com. The question is being asked, why Thomas Jefferson's anti-slavery passage was removed from the Declaration of Independence. The article says, with its soaring rhetoric about all men being created equal, the Declaration of Independence gave a powerful voice to the values behind the American Revolution. Critics, however, saw a glaring contradiction. Many of the colonists who sought freedom from British tyranny themselves bought and sold human beings. By underpinning America's young economy with the brutal institution of chattel slavery, they deprived roughly 1/5 of the population of their own inalienable right to liberty. How do you proclaim that all men are created equal when you're up to your eyeballs in profiting from enslaving human beings? This was the dilemma. Well, you have to devise wicked schemes to get the nation to believe that those enslaved people are not really human. They're no better than animals. And then you write laws to enforce it. Let's go on. It says, what isn't widely known, however, is that founding father Thomas Jefferson, in an early version of the Declaration, drafted a 168-word passage that condemned slavery as one of the many evils foisted upon the colonies by the British Crown. The passage was cut from the final wording. So he placed the blame on Britain for bringing slavery to the nation. What did the deleted passage say? In his initial draft, Jefferson blamed Britain's King George for his role in creating and perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade, which he describes in so many words as a crime against humanity. So listen to the words. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, Jefferson wrote, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Continuing, it says the exact circumstances of the passage's removal may never be known. The historical record doesn't include details of the debates undertaken by the Second Continental Congress. What is known is that the 33-year-old Jefferson, who composed the Declaration between June 11th and June 28th, 1776, sent a rough draft to members of a pre-selected committee, including John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, for edits ahead of its presentation to Congress. Between July 1st and July 3rd, congressional delegates debated the document, during which time they excised Jefferson's anti-slavery clause. The removal was mostly fueled by political and economic expediencies. While the 13 colonies were already deeply divided on the issue of slavery, both the South and the North had financial stakes in perpetuating it. And what should be obvious to all is that the leaders of this nation knew what they were doing was wicked. They knew it. But the love of money is the root of all evil. It goes on to say Southern plantations, a key engine of the colonial economy, needed free labor to produce tobacco, cotton, and other cash crops for export back to Europe. Northern shipping merchants, who also played a role in that economy, remained dependent on the triangle trade between Europe, Africa and the Americas that included the traffic of enslaved Africans. Decades later, in his autobiography, Jefferson primarily blamed two Southern states for the clause's removal, while acknowledging the North's role as well. So listen to what he wrote. The clause reprobating the enslaving the inhabitants of Africa was struck out in compliance to South Carolina and Georgia, who had never attempted to restrain the importation of slaves and who, on the contrary, still wished to continue it. I'm not surprised about South Carolina. It says, our northern brethren also, I believe, felt a little tender under these censures, for though their people have very few slaves themselves, yet they had been pretty considerable carriers of them to others. Now, let's not forget that Jefferson was a big part of the problem. He was not blameless when it comes to slavery. That's like the pot calling the kettle black. And the article addresses that. It says Jefferson himself had a complicated relationship with the peculiar institution. That's what we're going to call it, the peculiar institution. Despite his philosophical abhorrence of slavery and his ongoing legislative efforts to abolish the practice, Jefferson over his lifetime enslaved more than 600 people, including his own children, with his enslaved concubine Sally Hemings. Now you all, let's not pretty this up and call her a concubine. She was not his concubine. It says on his death in 1826, Jefferson, long plagued with debt, chose to free 5 of the human beings he claimed as property in his lifetime. Out of 600, you all, he chose to free 5. It says such conflicts didn't go unnoticed. How was it possible, wrote British essayist Samuel Johnson at the start of the war, that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? American loyalist and former governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, echoed these sentiments in his strictures upon the Declaration of the Congress at Philadelphia. The signers ultimately replaced the deleted clause with a passage highlighting King George's incitement of domestic insurrections among us, for stirring up warfare between the colonists and native tribes, leaving the original passage a footnote to what might have been. Indeed, removing Jefferson's condemnation of slavery would prove the most significant deletion from the Declaration of Independence. The founders' failure to directly address the question of slavery exposed the hollowness of the words all men created equal. Nonetheless, the underlying ideals of freedom and equality expressed in the document have inspired generations of Americans to struggle to obtain their inalienable rights.
With school boards and conservative groups pushing for book bans in record numbers, we can't overlook the role of state leaders who are shaping what children learn in school. Just this week, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis addressed his, quote, Stop Woke Act, which restricts race-based conversations in businesses and in school, and offered this up.
It was the American Revolution that caused people to question slavery. No one had questioned it before we decided as Americans that we are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights and that we are all created equal. Then that birthed abolition movements. So you can't teach history that's being used to pursue an ideological agenda.
Back with me, Van Jones, David Swerdlick, and Scott Jennings. Van,
I'm sorry, go
I
ahead.
had the same reaction. Slavery didn't end, and technically, till 1865, 1776. That's almost a.
Well, first of all, you know, you reveal a lot when you're speaking about stuff you don't know anything about. So he says nobody questioned slavery until, you know who questioned it? The enslaved people.
Slaves.
The enslaved people questioned it the whole time.
Let's shift just a little to look at this information from The Guardian. We want to see what was happening during the American Revolution. This says in 1776, the Declaration of Independence, which embraced in its first lines that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, did not extend that right to slaves, Africans, or African Americans, with the final version scrapping a reference to the denunciation of slavery. So you had these folks who were fighting for their own freedom while withholding it from others. It says Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner himself, penned those lines rejecting slavery. He removed the reference after receiving criticism from a number of delegates who enslaved black people. This could represent the fabric of the American political economy ever since, some historians have said. So it says slavery flourished initially in the tobacco fields of Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. In the tobacco producing areas of those states, slaves constituted more than 50% of the population by 1776. Slavery then spread to the rice plantations further south. In South Carolina, African Americans remained a majority into the 20th century, according to census data. So in 1860, it says the British operated slave trade across the Atlantic was one of the biggest businesses of the 18th century. Approximately 600,000 of 10 million African slaves made their way into the American colonies before the slave trade, not slavery, was banned by Congress in 1806. By 1860, though, the U.S. recorded nearly 4 million enslaved black people, 13% of the population in the country, as the American-born population grew. Listen to this. 8 of the first 12 U.S. presidents were slave owners. So as you look at the states that are colored, all of them had over 100,000 slaves. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia, though, had over 400,000. So do you think slavery was profitable in America? How could it not be when they were using free labor and producing enough goods for international trade? This says 1865. So let's see what was happening during the Civil War. It says, according to Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War was fought to keep America whole and not for the abolition of slavery. So for all who are saying Abraham Lincoln was the great emancipator and did it to help the enslaved, think again. This says Southern states said they wanted to secede to protect states' rights, but they were really fighting to keep people enslaved. Lincoln took on the fight for the freedom of slaves, some historians have suggested, because he was worried the British would support the South in its self-declared self-determination and recognize the South as a separate entity. If he had made the war about ending slavery, it would have looked bad for the South's fight and the British supporting its cause. Lincoln's death was probably the first casualty of a long civil rights movement that is not yet over. the historian Peter Colkin has suggested. What was happening in 1868? Some experts have argued that Reconstruction laid the foundation for the organization of new segregated institutions, white supremacist ideologies, legal rationalizations, extra-legal violence, and everyday racial terror, further widening the racial divide among blacks and whites. Others have pointed out that the end of the war left Black Americans free, but their status undetermined, with the passing of codes to prevent Black people from being truly free. 1898, the recession of the late 19th century, hit the U.S. Night riders went out in the dark, burning the homes of African Americans who bought their own land. They rode up to Washington to demand change, as Southern white Democrats rolled back many of the albeit limited freedoms from Reconstruction just a couple of decades before. Jim Crow era. It says the Jim Crow era of segregation forbade African Americans from drinking from the same water fountains, eating at the same restaurants, or attending the same schools as white Americans, all lasting until, and sometimes well past, the 1960s. Can we just say it's still happening? It's still happening. 1926. As African Americans were shut out of jobs and opportunities during Jim Crow, and as more jobs became available in the North and Midwest, more than 2 million Southern African Americans migrated after the First World War. Still even hundreds of miles away from Southern segregation, these migrating Americans were met by sundown towns, where Black people were not welcome after sunset, and by restrictions on where they could live in cities. And that's not all. Let's look at some of these laws.
Between emancipation and 1874, this is a period of a great deal of violence, uncertainty, and conflict in the South. There's no other way to describe. We call it the Reconstruction era. But really, at a local level, this is all about conflicts over independence and equality between blacks and whites. And the legal system plays an important role in this. The black codes were taken from the old slave codes, and these were laws that were meant to apply solely to black people. And they were laws that made it a crime, again, to be out after a certain hour, for possessing a weapon of any kind. Vagrancy was one. Let's say you had a skill as a slave. You wanted to be a barber, or you wanted to have your own shop, or even if a black woman wanted to be a laundress, you had to have a permit, and you had to pay money to get that permit. And if you were operating without a permit, you could be arrested under the black codes. These laws varied from state to state, but they all had the same purpose, which was to subject the freed people to their own particular kinds of control. You have people being arrested on charges from the black codes and put to work on the streets. And this is before the big convict leasing system emerges. These are all local laws. If you're arrested for vagrancy, if you're arrested for theft, if you're arrested for larceny, these are tried in local courts. These are not tried in federal courts. These are tried in local courts. There is actually very little that the federal government can do to intervene in these kinds of situations. That this was really a tool that was used to keep blacks in fear and also to curtail their independence. It's very common in newspapers, local county newspapers, for the press to describe who's in the local jail. And they'll say 73 in the Dallas County Jail, all Negro. So many people arrested for theft, all Negro. Now, these were meant to convey an idea that former slaves were inherently criminal. But what they really show is that whites didn't have to worry about the power of the law when it came to their behavior. It's inevitable that the combination of the legacy of slavery and the power placed in the hands of whites, these laws are going to be disproportionately used against black people, and they were.
Now I want to read some excerpts from this article from the National Review entitled American Slavery in the Global Context by Dan McLaughlin, and it's presenting the 9 distinctive features of American slavery. The article says systems of slavery, serfdom, and other forms of forced labor differed in many ways. The fundamental moral objection to bonded labor, its denial of human liberty and dignity, applies to every such system. Distinctions are matters of degree. American slavery had 9 distinctive features. Other slaveholding societies shared some of these, none shared all. First, slavery was racial. All American slaves were black Africans or their descendants. In 1860, 89% of all black Americans were enslaved. Most slave societies enslaved outgroups like foreigners, infidels, prisoners of war, but they varied in how race or ethnicity mattered. So it says the laws that enforced slavery extended burdens on free black people as well. South Carolina imprisoned any free black sailor who set foot on shore, even British subjects. Over time, racial slavery gave rise to increasingly elaborate theories of pseudoscience, bad history, and worse, theology to justify the subjugation of black slaves. Many of those theories persisted long after the last chains were broken. In Latin America, the color line was never as strict. Free black and mulatto citizens outnumbered slaves at least 2-to-1 everywhere, but Brazil and Cuba, where they were 40% of the population. The explorer Richard Burton observed in 1867 that in Brazil, all men who are not black are white, unlike the United States, where all men who are not unmixed white are black. Let's go on. It says, second, slaves were chattel. This was a deliberate legal fiction, American law acknowledged that slaves were fellow human beings. The original 1787 Constitution pointedly refers to them as persons rather than slaves or property. Southern law even theorized that slaves and masters had certain reciprocal duties, although in practice a slave's duties were compelled by force, while almost none of the slave owner's duties were enforceable. For every legal purpose that mattered, however, slaves were as much items of property as were horses or dogs. They could be sold without their consent, and in most cases abused or killed without consequence. This was not true of all slave systems. It says, third, slavery was inheritable. Our slave system did not simply subjugate captives in war, it put chains on their children, starting with Virginia statutes passed in 1661 to 62. Over the next 203 years, successive generations were born into slavery. 6 million died without ever tasting freedom. The American South was more rigid in its opposition to manumission or setting the slaves free than any other New World slave society. Fourth, America's slave population was self-sustaining, and we know what they mean by that. They used forced breeding, similar to what they did with animals. It says, most New World and Islamic slave systems required a steady infusion of imported slaves. Most in Africa required continual slave raiding. But from an early stage, American slaves had enough children to replace and even expand their population naturally. This was a larger factor by far than the other slave trade in the growth of American slavery from 463,000 imported captives by the early 19th century to 4 million in 1860. Fifth, American slaves were a large minority. At the outbreak of the Civil War, slaves were 39% of the population of the Confederacy, but a majority of the population only in South Carolina at 57% and Mississippi 55%. This distinguished American slavery from societies in which slaves were a comparatively tiny fraction of the population, but also from Caribbean societies where the enslaved were over 90% of the people, many of them working the plantations of absentee owners. 6. After the Revolution, slavery was exceptional. In much of the world, there was no such thing as a free citizen. All were subjects of a king or emperor with no legal rights against arbitrary power. From 1776 into the 1850s, the United States was the world's only democratic, republican, liberal, constitutional state. Between the 1620s and 1820s, many white Americans, typically Scottish, Irish, and German immigrants, lived for a time in the bondage of indentured servitude. And I'm hoping people will finally understand the difference, because they love to throw that up. Well, the Irish were slaves too. It says young people served bonded apprenticeships. Full civic participation was limited to landed men. As each of these barriers to free Republican equality fell away, black slavery stuck out even more conspicuously alongside white liberty. Slaves felt more unfree among the world's freest people. 7. American slavery was commercial. American slaves, unlike many in the Old World until the mid-19th century, were mostly engaged in growing crops for commercial export. By the 1850s, 3/4 of the world's cotton supply was grown by American slaves. Slaves in other systems served quite different purposes. Women were purchased as concubines or brides, and male slaves served as eunuchs, soldiers, even generals and ministers of states. It says, the medieval Mamluk sultans of Egypt were a class of slave rulers. Mamluk is Arabic for an enslaved person. Until they developed plantation systems in the 19th century, most Islamic societies used slaves in service, not production. 8th, from the 1790s through the 1850s, American slavery was migrating. Slavery, seen as a relic in 1787, found new vistas with the 1793 invention of the cotton gin, the settlement of Alabama and Mississippi, the Louisiana Purchase, and the annexation of Texas. In practice, the expansion of slave agriculture combined with the end of the external slave trade produced a second Middle Passage from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi Valley. America could not avoid its inheritance. It chose, however, to let the cancer grow. In 1780, almost half of the black population of the United States lived in Virginia. Slavery was in gradual decline for decades in Maryland and Virginia, but with the expansion of the country south and west, an estimated 1 in 5 slaves in the Chesapeake were moved or sold to Kentucky or points south of Virginia between 1810 and 1819 alone. The ability to sell surplus slaves on the interstate market gave Chesapeake slaveholders a continuing and lucrative stake in slavery's expansion and enforcement. Many of them became, for lack of a better word, breeders of enslaved men and women for sale. That's exactly what they were, breeders. It says 10% of Chesapeake slaves were sold away in their teens. Another 10% in their 20s. Ninth, American slavery ended abruptly. The United States in the 1860s was, aside from the French colonies, the only major slave society in the Western Hemisphere to immediately emancipate its slaves without first attempting some intermediate step. And this was exceptionally cruel, you all. They just proclaimed emancipation. And then they proceeded to enact laws to ensure that they would remain on the bottom. So this forced many of them into sharecropping and other schemes cooked up by this government to get them to work for free because they couldn't sustain themselves with the jobs they were able to find. They were locked out of the economic system. So this country basically put a system in place to ensure that they would remain a permanent underclass. You all, slavery was the fuel for the economic engine in this nation. They try to gaslight us when they say we didn't build this nation, but these facts don't lie. Listen to this information from history.com. How slavery became the economic engine of the South. It says slavery was so profitable. It sprouted more millionaires per capita in the Mississippi River Valley than anywhere in the nation. It says with cash crops of tobacco, cotton, and sugar cane, America's southern states became the economic engine of the burgeoning nation. Their fuel of choice, human slavery. If the Confederacy had been a separate nation, listen to this, it would have ranked as the 4th richest in the world at the start of the Civil War. The slave economy had been very good to the American prosperity. By the start of the war, the South was producing 75% of the world's cotton and creating more millionaires per capita in the Mississippi River Valley than anywhere in the nation. Enslaved workers represented Southern planters' most significant investment and the bulk of their wealth. And here's something most folks don't know. The hidden history of Wall Street's slave market. Most people think of the New York Stock Exchange when they think of Wall Street in Manhattan's financial district. The stock market at the exchange was built, like much of New York in the 18th century, on the back of the African slave trade economy. On December 14, 1711, a law passed by the New York City Common Council made Wall Street the city's first official slave market for the sale and rental of enslaved Africans and Native Americans. The facts are undeniable. that slavery propelled this nation to where it is today. The naysayers know this, but their pride won't let them admit it. But pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a great fall. This article from Vox says how slavery became America's first big business. Historian and author Edward E. Baptist explains how slavery helped the U.S. go from a colonial economy to the second biggest industrial power in the world. And the labor was free. But America says we should just move on, ignore the history. No, we're now revisiting our history in the light of who we are as a people. This is a major piece of the puzzle, and we're using scripture to see if we should just forget it and move on. I'm not seeing that. Are you? I see prophecies telling us how we got into our situation in the first place. Then I see curses that fit us to a T. And I also see prophecies about our redemption and restoration. So we have some more to cover on America, but for this session we'll wrap up here with these passages from Lamentations 4. Jeremiah is writing about the ruin of the city and the destruction of the priesthood and the kingdom. We see a depiction of Yah's judgment upon his people for their rebellion and idolatry. So he punished them. But you're also going to see the Father's goodness and his mercy. Some of these things happened and some are yet to come, because we know that it will all end with the restoration of his people and the reversal of the curse. So let's look at verses 11 through 15. The Most High has fulfilled his fury. He has poured out his fierce anger. He kindled a fire in Zion, and it has devoured its foundations. The kings of the earth and all inhabitants of the world would not have believed that the adversary and the enemy could enter the gates of Jerusalem. But here's why they were able to enter: because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who shed in her midst the blood of the just. They wandered blind in the streets. They have defiled themselves with blood, so that no one would touch their garments. They cried out to them, "Go away, unclean! Go away, go away! Do not touch us!" When they fled and wandered, those among the nations said, "They shall no longer dwell there." Now be sure to pay attention here, because you're going to see a shift where the curses lift from Israel and then the judgment passes to Edom. It says, "The face of the Most High scattered them," scattered us. "He no longer regards them. The people do not respect the priests nor show favor to the elders. Still our eyes failed us, watching vainly for our help." In our watching, we watched for a nation that could not save us. We were looking for the other nations to save us, to deliver us. No one came to our rescue. None. It says they tracked our steps so that we could not walk in our streets. Our end was near. Our days were over, for our end had come. So it seems like it's all over for Israel, right? Put a fork in it. It's done. The enemies felt or believed that they had accomplished their mission, which was to do what, family? Cut us off from being a nation. They didn't even want our name to be remembered anymore. Verse 19 says, our pursuers were swifter than the eagles of the heavens. They pursued us on the mountains and lay in wait for us in the wilderness. We couldn't escape them. The breath of our nostrils, the anointed of the Most High, was caught in their pits, of whom we said, under his shadow we shall live among the nations. Now listen. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, you who dwell in the land of Uz. They're rejoicing because, again, they think they have accomplished the mission. They wiped us out. They captured us, enslaved us. It says rejoice. But listen to the shift. The cup shall also pass over to you, and you shall become drunk and make yourself naked. Do you see that? In this series, we have seen how Esau mixed himself with the nations to inflict pain and suffering on the seed of Jacob. But it's now time for them to drink from their bitter cup. We're seeing the dawning of a new day, family. The dawning of a new day. What else does it say? The punishment of your iniquity is accomplished. Who is it talking about? O daughter of Zion. Listen to what he says. The punishment of your iniquity is accomplished. You did your time, in other words. The righteous judge found you guilty. You were sentenced. You had to do your time. But it says, the punishment of your iniquity is accomplished. He will no longer send you into captivity. He will punish your iniquity. Who's he talking about now? O daughter of Edom. He will uncover your sins. Did you see the shift? Did you see the shift, family? It is now time to pass the bitter cup. Our enemies will reap what they have sown. The shift is happening. It is happening right before our eyes. So we're going to continue with this the next time. We have more to cover on America. And we also need to look at the nations who were not as involved as the nations we covered in this series. This will be important because we are making our case to the righteous judge. And we want to know who the guilty parties are. But if this message has been a blessing to you, please hit the like, share it, and you are also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. Be blessed, family. Join me next time.